Okay, so next week, uh, we're going to have to be very disciplined with time in order to get through everyone's presentations. And what I'd like to recommend then is, let's look at our assignments first of all. I'm going to update the Google Drive folder. For the semester. And I don't know if this has been updated. This may not be updated. Okay. So I'm going to update these two links, but this link in particular will be updated to the Google folder so that you guys can upload the PowerPoints. Each presentation, each group, including feedback, no longer than 15 minutes. So that means that the presentation should be about 10 minutes. In order to make sure that we get through all the groups, since next week is the last week of class. Because last time I think we had one group left over. And that still might mean that we have to go a few minutes after 3 o'clock next week. So I've already heard from a couple of people that our travel plans were made and therefore people will be either missing class or leaving early next week. Hopefully we don't have too many of that, but still contribute to the group presentation and submit the paper. So those things will remain in effect even for those few of you who are not able to attend the last class session. But really, attendance is mandatory.
You can submit the paper to the Canvas assignment. Instead of emailing us, just submit it to the assignment on Canvas.
Okay, did we do that for the midterm?
Yeah.
Okay, we figured that out. And so how do you do that? What's the mechanism?
I think it's just under assignment.
Okay. Here, let me go to view as student so we can see what that looks like. Okay. So then you do that here. All right, great. All right. Okay. So for this week, we're going to have a kind of wrap-up discussion and consider the current state of art, but maybe for the last generation, for the last 50 years or so, where art has been since postmodernism. Since it's unclear whether we're in a post-postmodernist moment now or whether we're actually still in that postmodernist moment. Whether something changed circa 1970 that has remained in effect. Okay, so one thing I wanted to do is just start with the beginning of an article by Adorno called Those Twenties, written in the 1960s, and Adorno, who we've encountered before, but we're going to have a few readings by him today, had been in exile in the United States in the Nazi era and during World War II, but then went back to West Germany after World War II, and was therefore dealing with what appeared to be, in West Germany, the resumption of the Weimar Republic, so the Federal Republic, Germany, West Germany, which then absorbed East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall, is nominally in continuity with the Weimar Republic that ruled Germany after World War I and before the Nazis took over in 1933. What that meant was, in the 60s, and he's commenting not only in Germany, but more broadly, but maybe particularly in Germany in a certain sense, there was a nostalgia for the 20s. There was a nostalgia for this sense of opening and liberalization. It's the Roaring 20s, the period of, there was a kind of a sexual revolution, a revolution in gender roles and in people's relationships after World War I. Germany was one of the earliest countries to liberalize as regards gender and sexuality. So women got the right to vote in 1918 in the German Revolution of 1918, and soon followed in the United States and England, also in the Soviet Union, coming out of the 1917 revolution. It had that effect. France actually took longer. Women didn't get the right to vote in France until after World War II, interestingly enough. So it was a period of, like I said, liberalization, apparent emancipation, including in the realm of art and culture and in the literary field. Now, the Nazis, of course, reacted very strongly against this, meaning that they put an end to a kind of late avant-garde and modernist experimentation that had flourished in the 1920s. They called it degenerate art. They were very anti-modernist. Also in the Soviet Union, socialist realism had replaced the experimental modernism of the early Russian revolutionary, early Soviet era in the 1920s. So after World War II, but especially starting in the 1960s, there was an attempted return to this earlier history in the 1920s. And that's the background for what Adorno is talking about here. Okay. It says, slogans make themselves suspect not just because they serve to degrade thoughts into mere game-playing chips. They are also the index of their own untruth. What the public, and particularly the revivalist vogue, nowadays thinks belonged to the 1920s was in fact already fading at that time, by 1924 at the latest. The heroic age of the new art was actually around 1910. Synthetic Cubism, early German Expressionism, the free atonalism of Arnold Schoenberg and his school. Adolf Friese has noted this fact in a recent radio interview with Lotte Lenya, who was a kind of a star kind of singer at that time. I can clearly remember that after a IGNM festival in Frankfurt in 1927, I published an article entitled "The Stabilized Music." It was not, as is usually assumed, the pressure exerted by the National Socialist terror, that's what the Nazis were, they were the National Socialists, that brought regression, neutralization, and a funereal silence to the arts. For these phenomena had already taken shape in the Weimar Republic, and in liberal continental European society generally. The dictatorships did not swoop down upon this society from outside in the way that Cortés invaded Mexico. Rather, they were engendered by the social dynamic following the First World War, and they cast their shadows before them. This is immediately evident in the products of mass culture manipulated by a highly centralized economic power. One has only to listen to the record albums that are now being revived as the hits, songs, and chansons from the 1920s to be astonished at how little has changed in this whole sphere. As with fashion, the packaging changes, but the thing itself, a conventional language composed of signals to suit the conditioned reflexes of consumers, essentially remain the same, as jazz, for instance, was a perennial fashion. Jazz, I should point out, emerged out of black culture in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century, but then got taken up into the popular culture after World War I in the 1920s. So it got sort of mobilized, it got, we could say, commodified in the 1920s. Well, it seems that such past fashions have a naive and awkward aspect in comparison with the current trend, that they are what the slang of American light music calls corny. This is due less to the substance of what is disseminated than to the time factor in abstracto, at most to the progressive perfecting of the machinery of social psychological control. The quality of being not yet quite so smart, which provokes smiles from the same type of people who in those days acclaimed Mistinguett and Marlene, is of the same nature as the idealizing nostalgia that clings to those same products today. Marlene is Marlene Dietrich, if you've heard of her. She was a major movie actress in Germany and then in the United States. The period's comparative backwardness in the techniques of consumer culture is misinterpreted as though to mean it was closer to the origins, whereas in truth it was just as much organized to grab customers as it is in 1960. In fact, it is a paradox that anything at all changes within the sphere of a culture rationalized to suit industrial ideals. The principle of ratio itself, reason itself, to the extent that it calculates cultural effects economically, remains the eternal invariant. That is why it is somewhat shocking whenever anything from the sector of the culture industry becomes old-fashioned. The shock value of this paradox was already exploited by the surrealists in the 20s, when they confronted the world of 1880. So when we read the photography essay by Siegfried Kracauer, he was also looking back 60 years earlier, right? So he's talking about photography in the 1920s, photography in the 1880s. In England at that time, a book like Our Fathers by Alan Bott had caused a similar effect. Today, the shock effect is produced by the 20s, similar to the effect the world of images of the 1880s produced around 1920. But the repetition deadens the shock effect. The defamiliarization of the 20s is the ghost of a ghost. So that defamiliarization, that's also the estrangement effect. That's a term from Bertolt Brecht. In the German-speaking world, the imago of the 20s is probably not so strongly marked by the intellectual movements of the period. Expressionism and the new music at the same time found far less resonance than do the radical aesthetic tendencies of today. It was rather an imagistic world of erotic fantasy and was nourished by theatrical works that at the time stood for the spirit of the age and that today still easily pass for the same, even though their composition does not have anything especially avant-garde about it. The Songspiele that Brecht and Weil composed together, the Threepenny Opera and Mahagoni, and Ernst Krenek's Johnny are representative of this sphere. The subsequent discontent with civilization's progressive desexualizing of the world, which at the same time paradoxically keeps pace with the lifting of taboos, transfers onto the 20s romantic desires for sexual anarchy, the red light district, and the wide open city. There is something immeasurably mendacious in all of this. The enthusiasm for barroom jennies goes together with the persecution of prostitutes, who catch it from society's crystal clear order when no more suitable targets are at hand. If life in the 20s had really been so nice, then it would have been enough to leave the floozies in peace and stop trying to clean up the streets. Instead, antiseptically erotic films are made about the naughty 20s, or better still, about the Toulouse-Lautrec of our grandparents' time. So again, from the late 1800s. And yet, even back then, those girls weren't doing it for free. The wretched commercialized sex industry of the Kurfürstendamm, as portrayed by George Gross and transfixed by the words of Karl Kraus, was no closer to utopia than is the sterilized atmosphere of today. Nevertheless, the idea that the 20s were a world where, as Brecht put it in Mahagoni, everything may be permitted, that is, a utopia, also has its truth. At that time, as again shortly after 1945, so at the end of World War II, there seemed to be a real possibility of a politically liberated society. But it only seemed so. Already in the 20s, as a consequence of the events of 1919, that was the defeat of the German Revolution, the decision had fallen against that political potential that, had things gone otherwise, with great probability would have influenced developments in Russia and prevented Stalinism. It is hard to avoid the conclusion that this twofold aspect, on the one hand, a world that could have taken a turn for the better, and on the other, the extinguishing of that hope by the establishment of powers that later revealed themselves fully in fascism, also expressed itself in an ambivalence in art, which in fact is quite specific to the 20s and has nothing to do with the vague and self-contradictory idea of the modern classics. Okay, so what was he talking about there with the powers that revealed themselves fully in fascism? Well, of course, the fascist movement actually got its start out of the suppression of the German Revolution in 1919. So that's where the Nazis came from. They came out of the counter-revolution, the death squads in Germany in the German Civil War of 1919. So in a very literal, direct sense, the possibility of fascism was revealed. Precisely those operatic works that earned fame and scandal then seem now, in their ambiguous stance toward anarchy, as though their main function was to furnish National Socialism with the slogans it later used to justify its cultural terrorism, as though that assiduously exaggerated disorder was already lusting for the order Hitler subsequently imposed across Europe. This is not something for the 20s to boast of. The catastrophe that followed the period was engendered by its own societal conflicts, even in what is customarily called the cultural sphere. The extent to which nostalgia for the 20s, in fact, clings to something intellectual, and not merely to a fata morgana of a period supposed to be both at once avant-garde and yet not yet enwrapped in the cellophane of modernity, is decided less by the level and quality of what was produced at the time than by the true or putative intellectual posture itself. Preconsciously, one senses how much the revived culture is being absorbed by the ideology it has never ceased to be. Since one does not dare to acknowledge this, one projects an ideal image of a past condition in which spirit supposedly had not yet been forced to admit its incongruity with the forces of reality. In comparison to what has happened since then, spirit altogether takes on an aspect of triviality. It feels culpable because it could not prevent the horror, but its own tenderness and fragility in turn presuppose a reality that could have escaped barbarism. The imago of the time immediately preceding the catastrophe is invested with everything spirit nowadays is felt to be denied. The absence of intellectual movements that can intervene today, even the existentialism of the first years after World War II, was nothing more than a resuscitative renaissance, awakens even in the most naive people the sentiment of sterility. It contributes to the legend of the 20s as the time when the very domain of spirit tottered, while still maintaining its earlier relevance to people's lives. The fact that after 1918, Cubism lost its appeal is certainly a symptom that can be diagnosed only post-mortem. Let's see. So to quote Picasso tells me quite often today that everything that was done in the years from 1907 to 1917 could only have been done through teamwork. Being isolated, being alone, must have upset him enormously. And it was then that there was this change, meaning that Picasso changed his style once he was no longer able to work with others. The isolation that destroyed the continuity of the painter's work and brought him, and not only him, to start revising, was hardly the fate of a contingent biography. That isolation reflects the loss of the collective energies that had produced the great innovations in European art. The shift in the relationship between the individual spirit and society extended even into the secret-most impulses of those for whom any adaptation to the demands of society was anathema. There was no lack here of what the naive faith in culture calls creative gifts. The very idea of intellectual production had been poisoned. Its self-confidence, the certainty that it is making history, is undermined. This accords with the fact that, precisely in the context that it is assimilated, intellectual production no longer has any actual effect. And remember that from a perspective like Adorno's, art is intellectual labor, meaning even though it might take physical effort, it works on people's minds. It has an effect in our mental reality, not in our physical reality. Even its most extravagant expressions are no longer safe from being integrated into industrialized culture. Because the world spirit no longer coincides with spirit, the latter's last days shine resplendently as though they had been the golden age that in fact they never were. What remains is more an echo of fascist authority than anything itself living, the cultural respect for received values, even if they are merely touted as being important. Better would be a consciousness that realized its own diminished potential. Beckett has it. It's Samuel Beckett, the playwright and poet and novelist. It would no longer be a culture of renewed deception, but instead one that would express in its structure what denigrates spirit to the level of such deception. The only means by which culture can cure its curse of futility is by submitting that curse to interrogation. All right, so I wanted to say something about, again, the repression that took place both with the Nazis and in the Soviet Union after the 1920s. In the 1930s, this kind of cultural repression of art, of modernist and avant-garde art. So the idea was that it was decadent. So both the Nazis and the Stalinists in the Soviet Union complained that modernism and avant-gardism were decadent movements, that they were expressions of bourgeois decadence, that they were formalistic, that they were individualistic, right? That they represented a betrayal of the community, whether that was understood as the Nazi fascist national community or the Soviet socialist community. Still, the idea was that artists were somehow betraying the community in how they were practicing their work. And that they were demoralizing and psychologically deranging people because they themselves were deranged. Let's look at this. Anybody who is sensitive to such things need only examine the titles of the innumerable books, paintings, and compositions of the past few years to have the sobering feeling of the second hand. It is so unbearable because every work created nowadays makes its entrance, whether intentionally or not, as though it owed its existence to itself alone. The desire that proved fatal, namely the absence of a work's necessity to exist, gives way to the abstract consciousness of up-to-dateness. This ultimately reflects the absence of any political relevance. When it is completely transposed into the aesthetic domain, the concept of radicalness becomes an ideological distraction, a consolation for the real powerlessness of political subjects. However, there is no more compelling evidence of the contemporary cultural aporia than the fact that the critique of this ideological aspect of a sanitized, pure aesthetic progress itself immediately becomes ideology again. In the entire Eastern Bloc, that's the Soviet satellites of Eastern Europe, such a critique serves simply to make the conformity total by stifling the last unruly stirrings that have taken refuge in art. This surely means nothing less than the foundation of art itself has been shaken, that an unrefracted relation to the aesthetic realm is no longer possible. The concept of a cultural resurrection after Auschwitz is illusory and absurd, and every work created since then has to pay the bitter price for this. However, because the world has survived its own downfall, it nonetheless needs art to write its unconscious history. The authentic artists of the present are those in whose works the uttermost horror still quivers. All right, so from a few years later, this is a work that was published only posthumously by Adorno, who died in 1969. This is aesthetic theory. We'll read some things from the beginning and end of the book Aesthetic Theory that follows on some similar themes. So here's Adorno again. It is self-evident that nothing concerning art is self-evident anymore, not its inner life, not its relation to the world, not even its right to exist. The forfeiture of what could be done spontaneously and unproblematically has not been compensated for by the open infinitude of new possibilities that reflection confronts. In many regards, expansion appears as contraction. The sea of the formerly inconceivable, on which around 1910 revolutionary art movements set out, did not bestow the promised happiness of adventure. Instead, the process that was unleashed consumed the categories in the name of that for which it was undertaken. More was constantly pulled into the vortex of the newly taboo. Everywhere artists rejoiced less over the newly won realm of freedom than that they immediately sought once again for ostensible yet scarcely adequate order. For absolute freedom in art, always limited to a particular, comes into contradiction with the perennial unfreedom of the whole. In it, the place of art became uncertain. The autonomy it achieved, having freed itself from cultic function and its images, was nourished by the idea of humanity. As society became ever less a human one, this autonomy was shattered. So, of course, that's in the capitalist era. Drawn from the ideal of humanity, art's constituent elements withered by art's own law of movement. Yet art's autonomy remains irrevocable. All efforts to restore art by giving it a social function, of which art is itself uncertain and by which it expresses its own uncertainty, are doomed. Indeed, art's autonomy shows signs of blindness. Blindness was ever an aspect of art. In the age of art's emancipation, however, this blindness has become to predominate, in spite of, if not because of, art's lost naivete, which, as Hegel already perceived, art cannot undo. This binds art to a naivete of a second order, the uncertainty over what purpose it serves. It is uncertain whether art is still possible, whether with its complete emancipation it did not sever its own preconditions. The question is kindled by art's own past. Artworks detach themselves from the empirical world and bring forth another world, one opposed to the empirical world, as if this other world too were an autonomous entity. Thus, however tragic they appear, artworks tend a priori towards affirmation. The cliches of art's reconciling glow enfolding the world are repugnant not only because they parody the emphatic concept of art with its bourgeois version and class it among those Sunday institutions that provide solace. These cliches rub against the wound that art itself bears. As a result of its inevitable withdrawal from theology, from the unqualified claim to the truth of salvation, a secularization without which art would never have developed, art is condemned to provide the world as it exists with a consolation that, shorn of any hope of a world beyond, strengthens the spell of that from which the autonomy of art wants to free itself. The principle of autonomy is itself suspect of giving consolation. By undertaking to posit totality out of itself, whole and self-encompassing, this image is transferred to the world in which art exists and that engenders it. By virtue of its rejection of the empirical world, a rejection that inheres in art's concept, and thus is no mere escape, but a law immanent to it, art sanctions the primacy of reality. In a work dedicated to the praise of art, Helmut Kuhn warranted that art's each and every work is a paean. His thesis would be true were it meant critically. In the face of the abnormity into which reality is developing, art's inescapable affirmative essence has become insufferable. Art must turn against itself, in opposition to its own concept, and thus become uncertain of itself right into its innermost fiber. Yet art is not to be dismissed simply by its abstract negation. By attacking what seemed to be its foundation throughout the whole of its tradition, art has been qualitatively transformed. It itself becomes qualitatively other. It can do this because through the ages, by means of its form, art has turned against the status quo and what merely exists, just as much as it has come to its aid by giving form to its elements. Art can no more be reduced to the general formula of consolation than to its opposite. So this should recall, again, from the first week of class, Susan Buck-Morss. Right, so Susan Buck-Morss defined the work of artists as sustaining the critical moment of aesthetic experience. And she defined the reciprocal role of the theorist, or the critic, or the philosopher as recognizing it. And she took issue with cultural studies, which was a postmodernist phenomenon, by saying that it liquidated the category of art. It liquidated the illusion that art exists. It robbed art of categories of critical reflection. It reduced art back into culture, which we've encountered with Rosalind Krauss, and we'll encounter again today with Douglas Crimp. meaning to try to understand how art defines itself and its practices formally as engaged in a kind of cultural definition of itself. So when we read Sculpture in the Expanded Field, sculpture is defined by not being architecture or landscape, etc. So it's defined as a cultural category, leaving aside the whole question of its aesthetic constitution, right? Sustaining the critical moment of aesthetic experience that ends up getting left aside. I'll jump ahead here, just in the interest of time. Oops. Sorry. Oh, I jumped past where I wanted to be. Okay, prior to the emancipation of the subject, art was undoubtedly, in a certain sense, more immediately social than it has been afterwards. Its autonomy, its growing independence from society, was a function of the bourgeois consciousness of freedom that was itself bound up with the social structure. Prior to the emergence of this consciousness, art certainly stood in opposition to social domination and its mores, but not with an awareness of its own independence. There have been conflicts between art and society desultorily since Plato. Let's see. Ever since art was condemned in Plato's state, But the idea of a fundamentally oppositional art was inconceivable, and social controls worked much more immediately than in the bourgeois era until the rise of totalitarian states. On the other hand, the bourgeoisie integrated art much more completely than any previous society had. Under the pressure of an intensifying nominalism, so it's the idea that everything has its own rules, the ever-present yet latent social character of art was made increasingly manifest. The social character is incomparably more evident in the novel than it was in the highly stylized and remote epics of chivalry. The influx of experiences that are no longer forced into a priori genres, the requirement of constituting form out of these experiences, that is, from below, this is realistic in purely aesthetic terms, regardless of content. No longer sublimated by the principle of stylization, the relation of content to the society from which it derives at first becomes much less refracted. And this is not only the case in literature. The so-called lower genres, too, held their distance from society, even when, like Attic comedy, they made bourgeois relations and the events of daily life thematic. The flight into no man's land is not just one of Aristophanes' antics, but rather an essential element of his form. If, in one regard, as a product of the social labor of spirit, art is always implicitly a social fact, it's a fait social, social fact, in becoming bourgeois art, its social aspect was made explicit. The object of bourgeois art is the relation of itself as artifact to empirical society. Don Quixote stands at the beginning of this development. That's Cervantes' novel. Art, however, is social not only because of its mode of production, in which the dialectic of the forces and relations of production is concentrated, nor simply because of the social derivation of its thematic material. Much more importantly, art becomes social by its opposition to society. And it occupies this position only as autonomous art. So it's in trying to separate from society and trying to establish its own autonomy that art actually is at its most social, he's saying. By crystallizing in itself as something unique to itself, rather than complying with existing social norms and qualifying as socially useful, it criticizes society by merely existing, for which Puritans of all stripes condemn it. right? So whatever problems there might be with l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake, the condemnation of it is usually puritanical in nature. There is nothing pure, nothing structured strictly according to its own immanent law that does not implicitly criticize the debasement of a situation evolving in the direction of a total exchange society, in which everything is heteronomously defined. Heteronomous means defined by another, defined from outside, rather than from within. Art's asociality is the determinate negation of a determinate society. Certainly through its refusal of society, which is equivalent to sublimation through the law of form, autonomous art makes itself a vehicle of ideology. The society at which it shudders is left in the distance undisturbed. Yet this is more than ideology. Society is not only the negativity that the aesthetic law of form condemns, but also, even in its most objectionable shape, society is the quintessence of self-producing and self-reproducing human life. Art was no more able to dispense with this element than with critique, until that moment when the social process revealed itself as one of self-annihilation. And it is not in the power of art, which does not make judgments, to separate these two elements intentionally. A pure productive force, such as that of the aesthetic, once freed from heteronymous control, is objectively the counter-image of enchained forces. But it is also the paradigm of fateful, self-interested doings. So he's playing on Marx's idea of the contradiction between the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production. He's associating aesthetic form with the forces of production. And Marxism considered the forces of production to be constrained and distorted, dominated by the bourgeois social relations, which are the relations of commodity exchange. The exchange of labor as a commodity, the exchange of products of labor as a commodity, which had initially emancipated art. Art being a commodity first freed it from its traditional functions, but in the era of capitalism, the freeing aspect, the emancipatory aspect of bourgeois social relations turned into something else. It became a limit on what we can do in society, that everything has to be reduced to a job for which one is paid. Art keeps itself alive through its social force of resistance. Unless it reifies itself, it becomes a commodity. Now, that's an interesting idea. So art is a commodity, but it resists being a commodity by reifying itself, which means reifying itself as a commodity. It becomes a useless commodity and an unexchangeable commodity. Right? It reifies itself. It steps out of exchange relations. It tries to not be a commodity, even though it inevitably is. Its contribution to society is not communication with it, but rather something extremely mediated. It is resistance in which, by virtue of inner aesthetic development, social development is reproduced without being imitated. Now, you'll remember from Clement Greenberg, from Avant-Garde and Kitsch, that Kitsch imitates the avant-garde, and the avant-garde imitates the processes of art. So what would it mean to refrain from that imitation by turning it into a pure self-imitation? That's the same idea. At the risk of its self-alienation, radical modernity preserves art's immanence by admitting society only in an obscured form, as in the dreams with which artworks have always been compared. Nothing social in art is immediately social, not even when this is its aim. Not long ago, even the socially committed Brecht found that to give his political position artistic expression, it was necessary to distance himself precisely from that social reality at which his works took aim. Jesuitical machinations were needed sufficiently to camouflage what he wrote as socialist realism to escape the Inquisition. Music betrays all art. Just as in music, society, its movement, and its contradictions appear only in shadowy fashion, speaking out of it, indeed, yet in need of identification, so it is with all other arts. Whenever art seems to copy society, it becomes all the more an as-if. For opposite reasons, Brecht's China in The Good Women of Sichuan is no less stylized than Schiller's Messina in The Bride of Messina. So Schiller, that would be a kind of high bourgeois art from the Romantic era, and Brecht would be at the other end of the historical arc. All moral judgments on the characters in novels or plays have been senseless, even when these judgments have justly taken the empirical figures behind the work, that's not back of the work, behind the work, as their targets. Discussions about whether a positive hero can have negative traits are as foolish as they sound to anyone who overhears them from so much as the slightest remove. Form works like a magnet that orders elements of the empirical world in such a fashion that they are estranged from their extra-aesthetic existence. And it is only as a result of this estrangement that they master that extra-aesthetic essence. Conversely, by exploiting these elements, the culture industry all the more successfully joins slavish respect for empirical detail, the gapless semblance of photographic fidelity with ideological manipulation. What is social in art is its imminent movement against society, not its manifest opinions. So if you recall from Benjamin's, the author as producer, he set up a contradiction, a dialectical interplay, but really a contradiction between political tendency and aesthetic quality. So political tendency would be manifest opinions. Aesthetic quality, however, would be this imminent movement against society by trying to define itself aesthetically. Its historical gesture repels empirical reality, of which our works are nevertheless part, in that they are things. Insofar as a social function can be predicated for our works, it is their functionlessness. Through their difference from a bewitched reality, they embody negatively a position in which what is would find its rightful place, its own. Their enchantment is disenchantment. Their social essence requires a double reflection on their being for themselves and on their relation to society. Their double character is manifest at every point. They change and contradict themselves. It was plausible that socially progressive critics should have accused the program of l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake, which has often been in league with political reaction, of promoting a fetish with the concept of a pure, exclusively self-sufficient artwork. What is true in this accusation is that artworks, products of social labor that are subject to or produce their own law of form, seal themselves off from what they themselves are. To this extent, each artwork could be charged with false consciousness and chalked up to ideology. In formal terms, independent of what they say, they are ideology in that a priori they posit something spiritual as being independent from the conditions of its material production, and therefore as being intrinsically superior and beyond the primordial guilt of the separation of physical and spiritual labor. What is exalted on the basis of this guilt is at the same time debased by it. This is why artworks with truth content do not blend seamlessly with the concept of art. L'art pour l'art theorists like Valery have pointed this out. But the guilt they bear of fetishism does not disqualify art, any more so than it disqualifies anything culpable. For in the universally socially mediated world, nothing stands external to its nexus of guilt. The truth content of artworks, which is indeed their social truth, is predicated on their fetish character, again, their kind of commodity and reified character. The principle of heteronomy, apparently the counterpart of fetishism, is the principle of exchange, and in it domination is masked. In other words, trying to make socially responsible art doesn't really step outside the problem. Only what does not submit to that principle acts as the plenipotentiary of what is free from domination. Only what is useless can stand in for the stunted use value. So the use value as opposed to the exchange value of the commodity. Artworks are plenipotentiaries of things that are no longer distorted by exchange, profit, and the false needs of a degraded humanity. In the context of total semblance, or total appearance, art's semblance, or appearance, or the phenomenon of art, of being in itself, is the mask of truth. Marx's scorn for the pittance that Milton received for Paradise Lost, a work that did not appear to the market as socially useful labor, is, as a denunciation of useful labor, the strongest defense of art against its bourgeois functionalization, which is perpetuated in art's undialectical social condemnation. A liberated society would be beyond the irrationality of its false friends. Of its incidental costs. Incidental costs, that's what the phrase means. The irrationality of its incidental costs and beyond the ends-means rationality of utility. This is enciphered in art and is the source of art's social explosiveness. Although the magic fetishes are one of the historical roots of art, a fetishistic element remains admixed in artworks, an element that goes beyond commodity fetishism. Artworks can neither exclude nor deny this. Even socially, the emphatic element of semblance, or appearance, in artworks is, as a corrective, the organon of truth. Artworks that do not insist fetishistically on their own coherence, as if they were the absolute that they are unable to be, are worthless from the start. But the survival of art becomes precarious as soon as it becomes conscious of its fetishism, and, as has been the case since the middle of the 19th century, insists obstinately on it. Art cannot advocate delusion by insisting that otherwise art would not exist. This forces art into an aporia. All that succeeds in going even minutely beyond it is insight into the rationality of its irrationality. Artworks that want to divest themselves of fetishism by real and extremely dubious political commitment regularly enmesh themselves in false consciousness as the result of inevitable and vainly praised simplification. In the short-sighted praxis to which they blindly subscribe, their own blindness is prolonged. Jump ahead here. By virtue of its form, art transcends the impoverished, entrapped subject. What wants willfully to drown out its entrapment becomes infantile and makes out of its own heteronomy a social ethical accomplishment. It may be objected here that the various people's democracies, so that would be Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, today China, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, the people's democracies, are still antagonistic, and that they therefore preclude any but an alienated standpoint. Yet it is to be hoped that an actualized humanism would be blessedly free of the need for modern art and would once again be content with traditional art. This concessional argument, however, is actually not at all distinct from the doctrine of overcoming individualism, as still the socialist realist condemnation of modernism. To put it bluntly, it is based on the Philistine cliché that modern art is as ugly as the world in which it originates. That the world deserves it and nothing else would be possible, yet surely it cannot go on like this forever. In truth, there is nothing to overcome. The world itself is an index of falseness. There's another typo there. The world itself is the index of the false. There is no denying that the antagonistic situation, what the young Marx called alienation and self-alienation, was not the weakest agency in the constitution of modern art. But modern art was certainly no copy, not the reproduction of that situation. In denouncing it, transposing it into the image, the situation became its other, and as free as the situation denies the living to be. If today art has become the ideological complement of a world not at peace, it would, however, amount to the sacrifice of its freedom, were new art to return to peace and order, to affirmative replication and harmony. Nor is it possible to sketch the form of art in a changed society. In comparison with past art and the art of the present, it will probably again be something else. But it would be preferable that some fine day art vanish altogether than that it forget the suffering that is its expression and in which form has its substance. The suffering is the humane content that unfreedom counterfeits as positivity. If in fulfillment of the wish a future art were once again to become positive, then the suspicion that negativity were in actuality persisting would become acute. The suspicion is ever present, regression threatens unremittingly, and freedom, surely freedom from the principle of possession, cannot be possessed. But then what would art be, as the writing of history, if it shook off the memory of accumulated suffering? So that's the idea that what we have in the history of modernism, and looked at a certain way, postmodernism could be seen as a continuation of modernism, that what you have is an accumulated history of how humanity has suffered for the last 200 years in the era of capitalism. So if you recall also from the first day of class, Robert Pippin, he said art would be a diagnostic tool for looking at the suffering of the modern world starting in the middle of the 19th century. Same idea here. Now let's look at what Douglas Crimp tries to do with this circa 1980, sort of height of postmodernism in criticism and theory. Building on Adorno's Valery-Proust Museum, which I included just as a background so that you could read it for yourself. He cites this. Starts with a epigraph from Adorno's essay, Valery-Proust Museum. So let's see how Crimp quotes him here. The German word museal, museum-like, has unpleasant overtones. It describes objects to which the observer no longer has a vital relationship and which are in the process of dying. They owe their preservation more to historical respect than to the needs of the present. Museum and mausoleum are connected by more than phonetic association. Museums are like the family sepulchres of works of art. Okay, so why is it called the Valery-Proust Museum? So we saw the quotation from Valery at the beginning of Benjamin's work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And Proust here is Marcel Proust. And if you recall, Jean-Francois Lyotard, he said that there are sort of two souls to modernism. There's the kind of radical experimental soul of Kafka and Joyce, and then there's the more nostalgic, melancholic soul of Proust. Now, how does that figure here? So it's really about what was recognized by the end of the 1800s, and certainly by the early 1900s, that the situation of art in the museum is paradoxical. It's really self-contradictory. So again, going back to that Susan Buckmore's piece from the first week of class. She commented that artists are in the paradoxical position or caught in a dialectical cul-de-sac or self-contradictory dead end of attacking the very institution that keeps alive the illusion that art exists, and that's the museum. Or we could say artists rebel against art school when they're in art school. That happens too, often. Right, so you attack the very institution that maintains the illusion that what you're doing is something. Okay, so why? So if art is an illusion sustained by institutions like the museum, then what does that say about what has become of art? Especially because art used to exist outside the museum, but now seems to exist in the gallery, museum, critic, dealer system of adjudicating value, and that Susan Buck-Morse pointed out. We could also add school. Art schools are part of that circuit of creating value and maintaining value in the system. So either art dies and goes to the museum as a kind of a dead letter, as a dead artifact, or art is kept alive by the museum. All right, so really the question of art's right to exist, the life and death of art, or what Robert Pippin in the first week of class said, how long can art be about the end of art? Evidently, it can continue to be about the end of art indefinitely. It's been that since the mid-1800s, since the mid-19th century. And the museum plays a role in that. Meaning, what about the second life, the afterlife of artworks that happens in the museum? Now, something very specific about this is pertinent here, which is that artworks seem destined for the museum. It seems like artists make work that's meant to be ultimately exhibited at the museum. However, they only arrive at the museum after their run is over, we might say, meaning after they cease to be a commodity. So artworks are usually donated by the estate of people who die, right? So people collect artworks out of taste, but also out of trying to maintain their value as investments, as capital investments. And then they're donated to the museum, and after that they're no longer bought and sold. So the artwork ceases to be a commodity when it enters the museum. And by ceasing to be a commodity when it enters the museum, it leaves its initial context behind. So the initial context was, this is an artwork that was meant to be experienced, so it had a use value, it had an aesthetic value, it has a use value, but it had an exchange value, it was meant to be sold. And artists require their work to be bought and sold in order to maintain their own work, in order to be able to continue to make art. Although usually art gets a lot more value on the secondary market than on the primary market. So usually artworks, when they're initially sold, are not sold for very much. And so the artist only gets half of the value because the gallery gets the other half. And then later, on the secondary market, that's when they sell for a lot of money, and the artist has nothing to do with that. The artist doesn't have any claim on the value on the sale of the art in the secondary market. And yet, people are only going to buy their work on the primary market if their work sells on the secondary market. Right, so that's the paradox. So they have to continue to make work and not get paid very much, hoping that their work will fetch a lot of money on the secondary market that they will never themselves see. So I was shocked when I was an artist, although I worked in a peculiarly non-commodifiable genre, namely video art, but I met, artists in the plastic disciplines, painting and sculpture, who were very successful, and I was shocked at how modest their income was, meaning how little they actually made and how they supported themselves. So usually they made a decent income, a respectable income, but they had to supplement it with other things like speaking fees and teaching part-time, like a lot of the faculty here at SAIC, right? Because we have part-time faculty at SAIC because the expectation is that primarily they're doing their artwork, they're not primarily teaching. Right? But they still need to do that to support themselves, to support their work. So artworks, when they arrive at the museum, or even when conceived of as being somehow to do with the museum, already they've lost their life as objects of exchange, as commodities in that respect, because they're taken out of circulation. And they've lost their initial aesthetic context, their initial cultural moment. So it's usually a kind of historical after effect by the time they enter the museum. They enter into art history. And of course, artists want their work to enter into art history too, when they first make the work. They're thinking about the museum, they're thinking about entering into art history. But what is this art history? Meaning, is art history itself something whose existence or illusion is sustained only by the museum? And this is what Douglas Crimp is getting at. So his piece on the museum's ruins is trying to run with the idea that history exists only in the museum, and that artworks are really dead as living cultural objects by the time they reach the museum, and then only have this kind of zombie afterlife in the museum. They're also turned into objects of reverence. So the museum becomes what Benjamin in the work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction called a cult value or ritual value, and not really the exhibition value, paradoxically. So the exhibition value, you'd think the museum would be the pure exhibition value context, but no, it might be the cultic ritual context instead, where the museum is like the church of art, and where art history becomes a kind of creed or kind of religious archive of the beliefs and scripture of art. Okay, so let's see how Douglas Crimp addresses this. In his review of the new installation of 19th century art at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, Hilton Kramer attacks the inclusion of salon painting in the Andre Meyer galleries. Characterizing that art as silly, sentimental, and impotent, Kramer goes on to assert that had the reinstallation been done a generation earlier, such pictures would have remained in the museum's storerooms to which they had been so justly consigned. It is the destiny of corpses, after all, to remain buried, and salon painting was found to be very dead indeed. But nowadays, there is no art so dead that an art historian cannot be found to detect some simulacrum of life in its moldering remains. In the last decade, there has in fact arisen in the scholarly world a powerful sub-profession that specializes in these lugubrious disinterments. Kramer's metaphor of death and decay in the museum recalls Adorno's essay, in which the opposite but complementary experiences of Valery-Proust at the Louvre are analyzed, except that Adorno insists upon this museal mortality as a necessary effect of an institution caught in the contradictions of its culture, and therefore extending to every object contained there. Kramer, on the other hand, retaining his faith in the eternal life of masterpieces, ascribes the conditions of life and death not to the museum, or the particular history of which it is an instrument, but to our works themselves, their autonomous quality threatened only by the distortion that a particular misguided installation might impose. He therefore wishes to explain, quote, this curious turnabout that places a meretricious little picture like Gérôme's Pygmalion in Galatia under the same roof with masterpieces on the order of Goya's Pepito and Manet's Woman with a Parrot. What kind of taste is this, or what standard of values, that can so easily accommodate such glaring opposites? The answer, Kramer thinks, quote, is to be found in that much-discussed phenomenon, the death of modernism. So long as the modernist movement was understood to be thriving, there could be no question about a revival of painters like Gérôme or Bouguereau. Modernism exerted a moral as well as aesthetic authority that precluded such a development. But the demise of modernism have left us with few, if any, defenses against the incursions of debased taste. Under the new postmodernist dispensation, anything goes. It is an expression of this postmodernist ethos that the new installation of 19th century art at the Met needs to be understood. What we are given in the beautiful Andre Meyer galleries is the first comprehensive account of the 19th century from a postmodernist point of view in one of our major museums. So that's Hilton Kramer complaining about it. And then Douglas Crimp goes on, we have here yet another example of Kramer's moralizing cultural conservatism disguised as progressive modernism. But we also have a very interesting puzzle whose pieces are not, he says in my estimation, fitted together right, perhaps because a crucial one is missing. The pieces Kramer has assembled are the museum, art history, modernism, and postmodernism, to which I would add photography, and complete the puzzle to look, I would say, something like this. Okay, so this is Robert Rauschenberg, 1963 painting, Transom. He says, "For I want to claim that Rauschenberg's art, using the medium of photography and at the threshold of postmodernism, enacts a deconstruction of the discourse of the museum, of its pretensions to anything that we could possibly call knowledge." One of the early instances of the term postmodernism as applied to the visual arts occurs in Leo Steinberg's Other Criteria, in the course of a discussion of Rauschenberg's work, and its transmutation of the picture surface into what Steinberg calls a flatbed, referring significantly to a printing press. This flatbed picture plane is an altogether new kind of picture surface, one that affects, according to Steinberg, a radical shift from nature to culture. That is, it is a surface which can receive a vast and heterogeneous array of cultural images and artifacts that had not been compatible with the pictorial field of either pre-modernist or modernist painting. A modernist painting retains a natural orientation to the spectator's vision, which the postmodernist picture abandons. Although it is doubtful that Steinberg had a very precise notion of the far-reaching implications of this term postmodernism, a new term now used extremely promiscuously, his reading of the revolution implicit in Rauschenberg's art can be both focused and extended by taking this designation seriously. Presumably unconsciously, Steinberg's essay suggests important parallels with the archaeological enterprise of Michel Foucault. Not only does the very term postmodernism imply the foreclosure of what Foucault would call the episteme or archive of modernism, but even more specifically by insisting upon the radically different kinds of picture surfaces upon which different kinds of data can be accumulated and organized, Steinberg selects the very figure that Foucault uses to represent the incompatibility of historical periods, the tables upon which their knowledge is tabulated. Okay, so this is the idea. And let's bring up Rauschenberg. I don't know if this is the same one. Is it the same one? Yeah, it is. Okay. Oh, Christie's. All right, let's see. Oh, rubber. I don't know where I'm going to get those. eBay, my God. So people sell prints on eBay, I guess. I guess this is not on Wikipedia yet, huh? It's not considered noteworthy. I can find a good reproduction of it. No. The art newspaper. Let's see. The art newspaper, this is Laurie's thing, isn't it? No, it's not the same one. Similar, but not the same one. Okay. Let's go back. Should we go back to Christie's? See what we can do with this thing. All right. So the idea here is that there are really two different orientations towards the painting that are implied. So one, which is what we're doing now, is the subjective orientation towards the easel painting. So the easel painting being either a portrait or a landscape or a still life. So it's meant to be viewed head-on by a single viewer. It's an individual experience. The picture is composed to appeal to that kind of viewing. Now in the museum, the curators and the archivists, the people who maintain the paintings, how do they see the paintings when they're taking care of the paintings in storage? They lay them flat on a table. Right, so the fact that this is done by silkscreen reproduction, the flatbed, means that we have this simultaneous effect of looking at it upright, but also looking at it on a flat surface. So we're looking at it as a physical artifact, and we're looking at it as a picture at one and the same time. And the fact that it incorporates these bits from art history, as well as images from popular culture, like magazine photos, means that everything is being subject to the same kind of view, and things are being disoriented. So we have enough of an indication, I think this is Manet's Woman with Parrot, where we have a proper orientation here, but this photograph of a military helicopter is no longer that same orientation. That would only make sense if you were standing on the side. If it was lying on a table and you were standing on the side of it, then that orientation of that picture of the helicopter would make sense. So we have the sense of looking at it head on, looking at it from above, and looking at it from the various sides, as if it were laid out on a table. And that in this respect, it's very different from the way we share the orientation towards the painting that the painter had, the easel painting. Right? We are rather sharing the orientation of a silkscreen printer or of an archivist in the museum, right? Or an analyst of the physical object in the museum. So we've talked about this before, the difference between an image and a picture. So an image is the physical object, and the picture is what our imagination makes of it. So it's only in our imagination that we see things that are actually not there in the physical image. So we see lines and colors, we see space that are not actually physically there in the object. So here, something similar is happening. So you take something that seems to be composed on the flatbed, but you orient it as an easel painting. And then in our imagination, we imagine different subject positions from which we would see this object that are different from the head-on view of the traditional viewer, especially in the museum space. So if you know the white cube idea of the museum, that the ideal viewing experience is to have kind of isolated pictures on the wall, so you can take in one at a time. It's very different from the kind of exhibitions that took place in the 1700s and 1800s in the salon exhibitions. So use precise location. No. Okay, so let's see. Right, so at the this is the way things would have been exhibited. So the opposite of the white cube. So things would have been, they would have maximized the use of the wall space to hold as much, display as much visual art as possible. And that this starts to remind us of more like a warehousing of art. Whereas, in fact, where things are actually warehoused in the museum, they are stored and not in some kind of virtual display, but actually kind of hidden. More like books in a library. And, as he cites, more like photographs in an album. Photographs in an album. Right, so the idea that what has happened in the museum, and especially starting with an artist like Robert Rauschenberg, is that the true condition of art has been revealed. That it was sort of hidden behind the easel painting aesthetic, but that really it was just an archive of images, right? In which case you could freely shuffle them, and the collage effect here is important in that respect. So photo collage as revealing the truth of images in a way that the more traditional imitation of the easel painting style in photography would hide. So photography took as its genres the same as the easel painting: portrait, still life, landscape. But with photography, you could see something about those images as physical objects that was meant to be hidden behind the painting aesthetic. This is revealed, right? So this is like a kind of self-deconstruction of painting by way of photography. That's the idea anyway. Okay, so what's the invocation of Foucault about, since you guys will probably have some exposure to Foucault at some point, if you haven't already? I'm always shocked to hear that students had already read Foucault in high school. How many of you have read Foucault already? Anybody? Quasi? Okay, so maybe free. Maybe we are a postmodernist. Finally, that would be great. Okay, so what is Foucault's central thing? Power, knowledge, discourse. Power, knowledge, discourse. All right, so the idea that every form of knowledge is actually an exercise of power, and that it's deployed via discourse. All right, so the museum is the place where you have a kind of a storehouse of art history, of knowledge about art, would be the way of institutionally maintaining the power of art, which has to be sustained through a kind of discourse of art. Right, so if we keep in mind that people like Rosalind Krauss and Douglas Crimp, what they're really taking issue with is not this or that practice of art, or even this or that practice of exhibition, whether in galleries or in museums. What they're really taking issue with is other discourse, other writing about art. That's what they're really aiming at. That's why they're always quoting other critics, because they're like, well, this discourse about art is masking, even while it's deploying this power relation that art has become part of. So the museum, again, is this kind of stronghold for the power of art, but they're looking for their angle of entry to be able to attack it, and they themselves are not artists. Rosalind Krauss and Douglas Crimp are not artists, they're writers, they're critics. So what can they do? They can attack the discourse. They can attack the discourse. And how are they attacking the discourse? They're attacking it specifically by way of the artworks that are discussed. And they're trying to attack the reassimilation of these artworks into conventional art history. So they're trying to attack the assimilation of Robert Rauschenberg's work back into modernism. And they're doing that really by way of the historical avant-garde, meaning what we've talked about earlier in the course, this split between modernism and the avant-garde that took place in the 20th century. That wouldn't have made sense in the 19th century. It wouldn't have made sense with respect to artists like Courbet and Manet, or the Impressionists. But in the 20th century it becomes very important, because modernism becomes something that can be institutionalized, and it can exercise that power of the institution, versus the avant-garde that cannot be. So the idea is that the avant-garde is unassimilable to the institutionalization of art, and modernism is the discourse through which art is assimilated into this power institution. So Rauschenberg's work is specifically at this threshold of post-abstract expressionism. That's what the classification of Rauschenberg is, post-abstract expressionism. So if abstract expressionism was Jackson Pollock, and if you know your Jackson Pollock paintings, what are Jackson Pollock's paintings? Drip paintings, most famously the drip paintings. So those are paintings that were composed very much in the way that Robert Rauschenberg's work, Crimp is saying, wants to be seen, meaning lying flat. So you lay the canvas flat, you drip the paint from above, and then you reorient it back up on the wall as if it were an easel painting, and you maintain the pictorial illusion that the viewer has with respect to the physical object. Whereas Rauschenberg seems to defy that. It seems to be responding to the Jackson Pollock by insisting that the image be lie flat again. Okay, so here's some more Foucault. The Déjeuner sur l'herbe and Olympia, so that's Luncheon on the Grass and Olympia by Manet, were perhaps the first museum paintings, the first paintings in European art that were less a response to the achievements of Giorgione, Raphael, and Velázquez than an acknowledgement, supported by this singular and obvious connection, using this legible reference to cloak its operation, of the new and substantial relationship of painting to itself, as a manifestation of the existence of museums and the particular reality and interdependence that paintings acquire in museums. So if Manet's painting is painting about painting, then in this view that Crimp is borrowing from Foucault, that means painting about the museum. In the same period, The Temptation was the first literary work to comprehend the greenish institutions where books are accumulated and where the slow and incontrovertible vegetation of learning quietly proliferates. That's the library. Flaubert is to the library what Manet is to the museum. So Flaubert is The Temptation. They both produce works in a self-conscious relationship to earlier paintings or texts, or rather to the aspect in painting or writing that remains indefinitely open. They erect their art within the archive. They were not meant to foster the lamentations, the lost youth, the absence of vigor, and the decline of inventiveness through which we approach our Alexandrian age, but to unearth an essential aspect of our culture. Every painting now belongs within the squared and massive surface of painting, and all literary works are confined to the indefinite murmur of writing. Okay, so there's that term again, Alexandrian, the Alexandrian age, that refers again to what Greenberg was discussing in Avant-Garde and Kitsch. So when a culture becomes Alexandrian, what does that mean? It means that culture and art are no longer alive, but they're dead. They're now locked up in the library or the museum. So when knowledge is something that's not had in life, but something that is stored in a museum or a library, then it has died. Right, so what's going on here is that Crimp, by way of Foucault, is saying that modernism was immediately an indication of the end of art. meaning it was immediately an indication of Alexandrianism, and it was immediately destined for the museum, and therefore it was already declaring its own death. By contrast, what did Greenberg say? Greenberg said that modernism is the attempt, in its avant-garde aspect, to set Alexandrianism in motion. In other words, to indicate it, but also fight against it. To sort of struggle against that deadening that took place. Or, we could say, the decadence, or the barbarism, the kind of routinization, that art becomes just a rote, habitual activity rather than something that's really engaged in a transformative and free process of change. Right, so, the idea is that art as an institution maintained this illusion that art was still alive even after it was dead. So Manet's paintings showed that art was dead, but then people didn't accept that, so they pretended that art was still alive until Robert Rauschenberg comes and shows that, okay, it's dead, and it's been dead. Right, so there's an assimilation of Rauschenberg to Manet, meaning Rauschenberg is showing the truth of Manet in this view. Right? He's showing what Manet already showed, but in a way that can no longer be hidden by the institution of art, could no longer be masked, could no longer be repressed. So actually the idea here is that postmodernism is the return of the repressed, the return of the repressed. So what is the repressed? The repressed is the end of art, the death of art. Okay, so is that the end of the story, though? In other words, if art is about the end of art, according to Robert Pippin, and how long can we keep that going? And if that declaration of the end of art and rehearsal of that ending of art in art, if the art is generated out of that end of itself, then is that just a matter of the institution of art? Is that just a matter of art per se, or does it bear on society? In other words, is art just a cultural convention that keeps itself going, that reproduces itself through its institutions? Or does it have something to do with the society that it's in? Meaning, even if art is about the end of art, it's not just about that. It's also about the greater historical context in which that takes place. It's a protest against it. It's a protest against it. So certainly Manet trying to reproduce the old masters, for instance, when we looked at Olympia, as an attempt to reproduce Titian's Venus of Urbino, but under changed conditions. So to try to achieve the same thing, but necessarily differently, under our new conditions of modernity in capitalism, then that would also be a protest against the situation that art finds itself in the 19th century and up to the present. It's not just a kind of declaration, okay, art is dead, but it's a critical confrontation with that fact. So again, sustaining the critical moment of aesthetic experience. Similarly, we could say that just as Manet tried to reproduce Titian's and other Renaissance old masters for modernity, well, Rauschenberg is also trying to reproduce the effect of Manet in the 20th century. Meaning, maybe there's more to Rauschenberg than just this kind of send-up of the illusion of art, this exposure of the illusion of art. So when we looked at Manet's Olympia, and we looked at Titian, right? Crimp and also Foucault would have us believe that Manet is just doing a kind of parody of Titian. That's a send-up. That's confronting the viewer with a kind of mockery of the history of art. But it's not just that. It's not a send-up. It's not meant to be a parody or a mockery. It's actually meant to achieve the same thing, aesthetically and convincingly, to use Michael Fried's language, as Titian was able to do for his time. So the point is that you can't just reproduce this, you can't just imitate it, you can't do a kind of institutionalized romantic imitation of the old masters. You have to do it differently in order to achieve the same thing. Which doesn't mean, oh, here, this is an illusion that art exists, and let me kind of parody the history of art and let me mock the viewer and the viewer's expectation that art exists. I would say that it's also true that it would be wrong to say that Rauschenberg is merely doing that. That Rauschenberg is just making a mockery of the illusion that art exists. That he's just doing a parody of modernism in the way that Foucault and Douglas Crimp would have us believe. So then the question is, what's the pathos? What's the pathos of mixing popular imagery of the War of Vietnam with Manet and with post-industrial landscapes and architecture, little fragments of images, and so looked at from the sides as well as from the front, right? What does it mean that art has become something that can only be found in a mausoleum or museum? And that maybe it's only truly appreciated by people who treat it archivally rather than aesthetically. Right? What about that tension? Isn't there a pathos there? And therefore a protest against that situation, and not just a reveling in it, not just a demonstration of it. Again, not just a send-up of it. What's the suffering that is expressed by Rauschenberg, rather than the cleverness of someone who can demonstrate that art doesn't really exist and is just a self-sustaining cultural activity in a museum? Okay, so that's postmodernism. So what I'd like you guys to do in the second half of class today is to take up the question of postmodernism as an ambivalent relationship to the museum, the ambivalent relationship to the institution of art, including, of course, where we are now. Right? We're in art school, which is part of that same system. Right? The dealer, critic, gallery, museum system. The school is inherently part of that, both at the level of the production of artists and also the production of critics. The production not only of artworks, but also of discourse about them. As our consideration of where we are today in this postmodernist moment. Right? Do we still have this Foucauldian deconstruction attitude towards art, or can we admit that there's more to it than that? Okay, thanks guys.